She was selling out arenas before she ever played a professional game. Her jersey was the most wanted piece of fabric in women's sports history. And yet, when it mattered most, they handed her someone else's number and expected her to smile. She didn't just smile. She made history wearing it. But before we get to what happened on that court in Puerto Rico, before we talk about Sophie Cunningham and the fire she brought with her, before we break down what jersey number 12 actually means in the bloodline of this sport, we have to go back. Way back. Because this story doesn't start in 2026. It starts in the summer that broke the internet and exposed just how far behind the establishment really was. June 2024. That's where everything began. Caitlin Clark was already a phenomenon before she ever laced up in the WNBA. At the University of Iowa, she didn't just win games. She rewrote the record books. She broke the all-time NCAA scoring record, a record that had stood across both men's and women's basketball, and she did it with a smile, a logo three-pointer from the half-court line, and a confidence that made scouts and executives nervous in ways they couldn't quite explain. March Madness wasn't just a men's tournament anymore. It was Caitlin Clark's stage, and the ratings proved it. Millions tuned in. New fans were born. An entire generation of young girls found their hero. Then came the WNBA draft. The Indiana Fever called her name first overall, and the moment felt like a coronation. Gainbridge Fieldhouse transformed overnight. Tickets became the hardest thing to find in Indianapolis. Clark came in averaging numbers that would embarrass most veterans: nearly 17 points per game, over 6 assists per game, and a pass selection so advanced that commentators were struggling to find proper comparisons. She wasn't adjusting to the professional level. The professional level was adjusting to her. So when USA Basketball gathered to select the 12-player roster for the 2024 Paris Olympics, the assumption across the country was simple. Of course she was going. Of course. Who else had done more for this sport in a single season? Who else had moved the needle so dramatically, so undeniably, that even people who had never watched a women's basketball game in their lives were suddenly checking box scores? The committee announced the roster on June 11, 2024. Caitlin Clark was not on it. The reaction was immediate, volcanic, and completely justified. Social media caught fire. Sports radio didn't talk about anything else for days. The committee cited experience, pointing out that Clark lacked senior national team appearances and that all 12 selected players had that background. They said marketing and popularity weren't factors. And maybe, technically, they were telling the truth. But technically correct and completely right are two very different things. The sport was in the middle of a genuine cultural explosion, powered almost entirely by one player, and the decision-makers chose to look the other way. Clark herself? She did something almost impossible in that moment. She refused to become a victim of it. She showed up at practice. She kept playing. She dropped 30 points on Washington the night the news broke, as if the basketball court was the only place where the noise couldn't reach her. When reporters pushed her for frustration, for bitterness, for anything they could use as a headline, she gave them grace instead. She said she was happy for her teammates who made the roster. She said it gave her something to work toward. Those words sounded humble. They were actually a warning. Because what happened next? The jersey, the number, the teammate who became her shadow and her shield, wasn't a coincidence or a footnote. It was the continuation of a story that started with that snub, written by a player who was done waiting for anyone's permission. Sophie Cunningham watched all of it. And she had already made up her mind. There are players who make the highlight reel. And then there are players who make sure the highlight reel is even possible. Sophie Cunningham is the second kind. And the moment she decided to stand next to Caitlin Clark, the entire dynamic of women's basketball shifted in ways nobody fully anticipated. But to understand why Cunningham matters so much to this story, you have to understand where she came from, and more importantly, what she was willing to risk to protect something she believed in. Sophie Cunningham out of the University of Missouri wasn't a player anyone handed anything to. She was physical, competitive, and unafraid of contact in a way that made coaches nervous and opponents uncomfortable. She arrived in the WNBA with the Phoenix Mercury in 2019 and spent years doing the work that doesn't show up in the box score. Setting screens. Playing defense on the toughest assignment. Doing whatever the team needed, quietly, consistently, without complaint. She was the kind of player that veterans trust and coaches lean on precisely because she never made it about herself. Until 2024. Until Caitlin Clark walked into the league and the ugliness came with her. Here's something the casual fan might not fully remember about Clark's rookie season. It wasn't just celebrated. It was contested, in ways that were deeply uncomfortable to watch. There were hard fouls that crossed lines. There were moments on the court that had nothing to do with basketball and everything to do with something more complicated. A resistance, maybe, to the idea that one rookie could show up and immediately command this much attention, this much reverence, this much space. Clark was getting hit hard, repeatedly. And the league's response at times felt inadequate. Cunningham was watching all of it. She had been traded to the Indiana Fever in a move that, at the time, seemed like a roster transaction. In hindsight, it looks more like destiny. Because from the moment she arrived alongside Clark, Cunningham's role became something that transcended traditional position labels. She was still a wing. She was still a scorer. But she was also, unmistakably, a protector. The clips went viral almost immediately. Cunningham stepping in when things got physical. Cunningham making it crystal clear to anyone on the floor that there was a price for crossing a certain line. Not reckless, not dirty, but absolutely intentional. She was sending a message, and the message was received across the entire league. If you come for Clark, you come for all of us, and I am not the one to test. What made Cunningham's role so compelling wasn't just the physicality. It was the authenticity behind it. This wasn't assigned. Nobody told Sophie Cunningham to become Caitlin Clark's enforcer. She chose it. She looked at the situation, assessed what was happening, and decided that standing up was more important than staying neutral. In a league where politics can be complicated, where relationships run deep and loyalties are tested, that choice carried real weight. And Clark felt it. In interviews, she spoke about Cunningham with a warmth that went beyond teammate appreciation. There was a trust there, the kind that only develops when someone has proven repeatedly that they will show up for you when the moment is hardest. Clark had spent her rookie year absorbing punishment with a composure that earned respect from everyone watching. But composure has limits. Having someone in your corner who is willing to absorb the fight on your behalf changes everything. It changes how freely you play. It changes how much mental energy you spend worrying about what's coming from behind. Cunningham gave Clark freedom. That freedom showed up in Clark's game in ways that are difficult to quantify but impossible to miss. And then came Team USA. When the call came for the 2026 FIBA World Cup qualifying campaign, both Clark and Cunningham earned spots on the roster. For Clark, it was the culmination of everything she had worked toward since that June morning in 2024 when her name wasn't called. For Cunningham, it was another stage, another opportunity to compete at the highest level of international basketball. But what nobody expected, or maybe everybody should have expected, given everything they had already shown the world, was that the dynamic they had built in Indiana would follow them straight onto the international court. The jersey situation landed first. Clark was assigned number 12, a number she didn't ask for and couldn't have predicted would carry the weight that it did. Cunningham had her own number, her own preparation, her own mental space to manage. But the story circulating in the days before the tournament began wasn't about statistics or matchups or America's chances against the competition. It was about whether Sophie Cunningham was going to play at all. Reports began to surface, fragmented at first, then louder, that Cunningham had concerns. That something about the situation didn't sit right with her. That the player who had spent the better part of 2 years becoming the most reliable presence in Clark's professional world was now, on the eve of representing her country, wrestling with something that went deeper than basketball strategy. The speculation ran wild, the way it always does when the facts are incomplete and the audience is enormous. Was it about Clark's jersey assignment? Was it about roster decisions? Was it about the internal culture of the national team program and whether the new generation of players felt genuinely welcomed, or merely tolerated? Nobody had the full answer. But everybody had an opinion. And somewhere in a hotel room in Puerto Rico, Sophie Cunningham was making a decision that would define how the world remembered her, not just as a player but as a person. There are moments in sports where the story happening off the court becomes bigger than anything happening on it. Puerto Rico, March 2026, was one of those moments. The FIBA Americas qualifying tournament was supposed to be a formality. Team USA arriving, dominating, punching their ticket to the World Cup and heading home. That was the script. That was always the script when the United States sent a roster loaded with WNBA talent to a regional qualifying event. Nobody expected drama. Nobody expected the kind of tension that would spill out of practice facilities and into headlines halfway around the world. But then the report started. It began the way these things always begin. A murmur on social media, an unnamed source in a brief paragraph buried in a basketball newsletter. Something was off inside the Team USA camp. A player wasn't fully participating. There was friction. There was an atmosphere that didn't match the polished, unified image USA basketball had spent decades cultivating. And the name attached to the friction was one that the basketball world had come to associate with loyalty, toughness, and an absolute refusal to stay quiet when something felt wrong. Sophie Cunningham. The initial reports were vague enough to generate maximum speculation. Was she injured? Was she in conflict with coaching staff? Was this about Caitlin Clark and the jersey, the number, the symbolism that had already consumed so much conversation in the weeks leading up to the tournament? Fans filled in the blanks with whatever narrative fit their existing beliefs, and the result was a story that grew larger and louder with every passing hour. Here is what the noise got right and what it got wrong. Cunningham was not refusing to play out of pettiness. Anyone who had watched her career with any real attention understood that pettiness wasn't in her vocabulary. This was a player who had spent years doing thankless work without complaint, who had chosen a supporting role not because she lacked the talent for more, but because she understood what the team needed and put that above her own statistics. Pettiness didn't fit the profile. What was real was something more nuanced and in many ways more interesting. The transition from WNBA basketball to international play under FIBA rules is not a casual adjustment. It is a genuine cultural shift inside a program, and for players who are arriving for the first time, that shift can feel abrupt, even alienating. The veteran hierarchy that USA basketball maintains, returning players retaining their numbers, newcomers slotting into whatever remains, the unspoken seniority embedded in every room they walk into, is a system that works smoothly when everyone feels valued within it. When that feeling of value is absent, the system creates distance instead of cohesion. Cunningham felt that distance. Not because anyone was overtly hostile. Not because there was a confrontation in a film session or an argument during warm-ups. But because the environment communicated something to her that no speech or press release could undo. She had spent 2 years being the most important non-Clark presence on the Indiana Fever, a player whose contributions were understood and appreciated by everyone who shared that locker room. Walking into the national team environment meant starting from scratch in a hierarchy where her history with Clark didn't automatically transfer into respect from the broader group. And meanwhile, Clark was navigating her own version of the same adjustment. The jersey was number 12. Clark had explained it publicly, handled it gracefully, framed it in the most generous possible terms. But the weight of wearing someone else's number, even a legendary number, even a number being offered as an inheritance rather than an imposition, is something that settles differently when you're actually in it, actually pulling it over your head in a locker room surrounded by people who have worn their own numbers for years. Clark was adjusting. Cunningham was adjusting. And the adjustment, for a few critical days in Puerto Rico, looked from the outside like it might fracture something important. The practice reports were the flashpoint. Cunningham's participation was described as limited, her engagement as something less than the full commitment USA basketball expected from every player on the roster. Coaching staff addressed it internally. The conversation that followed wasn't public, wasn't leaked, wasn't performed for cameras. It was honest, direct, and by most accounts, productive. Because here is the part of the story that the loudest voices online consistently missed. Sophie Cunningham didn't pull back because she didn't want to be there. She pulled back because she did, and because caring deeply about something means feeling its weight in ways that casual participants never will. She wanted this experience to be real, not performed. She wanted to feel like herself inside it, not like a guest who was allowed in the building but not quite invited to sit down. The moment that shifted everything wasn't a grand gesture or a confrontation. It was a conversation. Clark sought Cunningham out. Not as a captain making rounds, not as a teammate fulfilling an obligation, but as someone who understood exactly what Cunningham was carrying because she was carrying a version of it herself. Two players who had built something genuine in Indiana, now trying to rebuild it in a different context, under different pressure with different stakes attached. What was said in that conversation has never been fully reported, and honestly, it doesn't need to be. The outcome told the whole story. Cunningham was on the floor for the first game. Not tentatively, not reluctantly, but completely. The player who showed up against the first opponent wasn't someone managing her minutes or protecting her peace from a comfortable distance. She was the same Sophie Cunningham that Indiana Fever fans had watched for 2 years, physical, present, ferocious in her defense, and absolutely locked into the player wearing number 12. The moment the basketball world had been waiting for, the moment where the tension either exploded or resolved so cleanly that some people refused to believe it was genuine. But it was. Because the thing about authentic relationships is that they don't require perfect conditions to survive. They require honesty, and the willingness to show up for each other even when the environment is uncomfortable. Cunningham showed up. Clark gave her every reason to. And Puerto Rico was only just beginning. There is a moment in every great sports story where the narrative stops being about the present and starts being about permanence. Puerto Rico was that moment for Caitlin Clark. Not because of what she scored. Not because of what the box score said when the final buzzer sounded and Team USA had done exactly what everyone expected them to do, which was qualify comfortably and move on. The permanence wasn't in the result. It was in what the result represented. The closing of a chapter that had opened with a rejection, carried through 2 years of relentless work, and ended with a player finally standing on the international stage she had been told, directly and indirectly, she wasn't ready for. She was ready. She had always been ready. The people making those decisions in June 2024 were not wrong to follow their criteria. But criteria and vision are two different things, and what the summer of 2024 exposed was a gap between the institutional framework of USA basketball and the cultural moment the sport was actually living in. Institutions protect what they have built. Visionaries see what is being built next. Clark was the future arriving ahead of schedule, and the institution needed time to catch up. Puerto Rico was the catch-up. And the number 12 was the symbol of it. Diana Taurasi spent more than 2 decades being the answer to every question about who owned the soul of international women's basketball. 6 Olympic gold medals. 3 World Cup championships. A competitive fire so intense and so sustained that it became the standard by which every subsequent generation of American players was measured. When Taurasi wore number 12 for Team USA, it wasn't just a jersey. It was a declaration. It said this program belongs to excellence and I am its living proof. When that number passed to Clark, Taurasi didn't grieve it. She recognized it. She said publicly, with the clarity of someone who has spent a lifetime understanding exactly what they are looking at, that she couldn't think of anyone better to take it and do something with it. That Clark was going to put gold medals on that jersey. That the inheritance was not a diminishment of what came before but an extension of it. Think about the architecture of that statement for a moment. Taurasi, who competed against everyone, who measured every challenger and found them wanting for 2 decades, looked at Caitlin Clark and saw not a threat but a continuation. That is not something she would have said about a player she had reservations about. That is not something she would have offered as a courtesy. Taurasi does not do courtesy. She does honesty, delivered at full volume, and what she said about Clark and number 12 was the most honest assessment anyone in the sport could have offered. The torch wasn't taken. It was handed. Deliberately, publicly, and with the full weight of everything it represented attached to it. Clark understood that weight when she pulled on the jersey in Puerto Rico. Whatever discomfort she felt wearing a number that wasn't her own, whatever adjustment she had to make internally to separate herself from the 22 that had defined her identity since Iowa, dissolved the moment she understood what she was actually wearing. She wasn't wearing a replacement. She was wearing a responsibility. And she carried it the way Taurasi would have wanted. But this story isn't complete without acknowledging something that tends to get lost when the narrative becomes too focused on individual greatness. What happened in Puerto Rico wasn't a solo performance. It was a demonstration of what women's basketball looks like when its best players are given the environment they need to be their best selves. Sophie Cunningham is part of that story permanently now. Not as a footnote. Not as a supporting character whose role diminishes as Clark's star rises higher. But as someone whose presence fundamentally shaped what Clark was able to do, both in Indiana and on the international stage. The enforcer who chose her side. The teammate who showed up when the pressure was highest and the doubts were loudest. The player who had her own adjustment to make in Puerto Rico and made it honestly, not perfectly but honestly, which is always more durable than perfection. Great teams are not built from great players alone. They are built from great players who choose each other, who decide that the person standing next to them is worth protecting and pushing and being honest with, even when honesty is uncomfortable. Clark and Cunningham built that in Indiana under conditions that were genuinely difficult, and they carried it to Puerto Rico under conditions that tested it in new ways. Held. That matters more than any individual statistic from the qualifying tournament. Because what Clark is building now, the career, the legacy, the answer to every person who told her to wait her turn, is not a solo project. It is a collective effort, and the people she chooses to build it with are as much a part of the story as she is. The 2026 FIBA World Cup looms ahead now. A genuine international stage, full competition, the full weight of representing the United States against the best players every other country has to offer. Clark will be there. Cunningham, all indications suggest, will be there beside her. The number 12 will travel with them, carrying Taurasi's gold medals in its history and reaching toward whatever Clark adds to that history next. The snub of 2024 will be referenced in that conversation as it should be. Not with bitterness because Clark has never given it bitterness but as context. As the chapter that had to happen before the chapters that followed could mean what they mean. The rejection that turned into fuel. The roster decision that, in a strange and unintentional way, gave Clark exactly the motivation she needed to become the player she was always going to become, just faster. Every great legacy requires a moment of resistance. Something that pushes back hard enough to reveal what a person is genuinely made of. For Clark, that moment came in June 2024, when her name wasn't called and the world waited to see how she would respond. She responded with everything she had. She is still responding. And the number on her back? It doesn't say 22. Not on this stage. Not yet. But when she lines up under that number 12 and the lights find her and the crowd goes quiet in that particular way crowds go quiet when they sense something historic is about to happen. In that moment, the number doesn't matter at all. What matters is who is wearing it. And the world, finally, completely, undeniably, knows exactly who that is. When the qualifying tournament ended and Team USA boarded their flight home, the basketball world didn't move on. It couldn't. Because what had happened in Puerto Rico wasn't the kind of story that gets filed away under tournament results and forgotten by the next news cycle. It was the kind of story that rewrites the conversation. That forces people to reassess what they thought they knew, revisit positions they had held with confidence, and reckon with the possibility that the sport they thought they understood had quietly evolved into something larger than their framework could contain. The reactions came in waves. The first wave was immediate and loud. Social media did what social media does. It amplified everything simultaneously, the celebration and the criticism, the vindication and the revisionism. Clark's performance metrics from the tournament circulated alongside the jersey controversy clips, alongside the Cunningham practice reports, alongside Taurasi Sports Illustrated quotes, all of it compressed into a single overwhelming conversation that was impossible to follow in real time but impossible to ignore. The people who had defended Clark's Olympic omission in 2024 largely stayed quiet. Not all of them. Some found ways to recalibrate without conceding anything directly, which is its own particular skill. But the loudest voices from that summer, the ones who had constructed the most elaborate justifications for why the selection committee got it right, were noticeably absent from the Puerto Rico discourse. The footage had a way of making certain arguments feel very small very quickly. The people who had been outraged by the snub felt something more complicated than satisfaction. There was vindication, certainly. But 2 years of carrying that frustration, 2 years of defending Clark against every dismissal and every caveat, had a weight to it that didn't simply evaporate because the moment of proof finally arrived. It settled, slowly, into something quieter and more permanent. A feeling that the right thing had eventually happened, which is not the same as feeling that the right thing had been done from the beginning. Those are different feelings. And the distinction matters. The second wave of reaction came from within the sport itself, from players and coaches and executives whose responses carried the kind of authority that fan discourse cannot replicate. Coaches who had faced Clark in WNBA play spoke about her international performance with a specificity that communicated genuine respect. This was not the polished, diplomatic praise that athletes offer each other in press conferences. This was film room language, detail language. The kind of analysis that only comes from someone who has spent real hours trying to solve a problem and found it unsolvable. They talked about her pace manipulation, her ability to change speeds in a way that makes defensive rotations perpetually late. They talked about her vision off the dribble, the capacity to see cutters before they have fully committed to their cuts. They talked about what it costs defensively to try to take away her three-point shooting, the compromises it forces, the gaps it creates, the way every adjustment opens something else. Players who had been skeptical, and there were some, because genuine competition produces genuine skepticism, offered assessments that were measured but meaningful. The acknowledgement that Clark had handled the international transition better than expected. That her court presence communicated something beyond individual talent, a kind of leadership that doesn't require captaincy or seniority to be felt by everyone on the floor with her. The third wave was the one that will matter longest. The cultural wave. Women's basketball had been building towards something for years before Clark arrived. The foundation was real and it was deep. Players like Breanna Stewart, Aya Wilson, Sabrina Ionescu had been expanding the sport's audience and elevating its competitive quality in ways that deserved far more mainstream attention than they received. The infrastructure was there. The talent was there. What was missing was the singular crossover moment, the player whose appeal transcended the existing fan base and pulled in people who had never previously considered themselves part of the audience. Clark was that player. She had been that player since Iowa, and the WNBA's ratings explosion in 2024 was the quantitative proof of something qualitative that anyone paying attention had already felt. But here is what Puerto Rico added to that cultural equation. It added legitimacy on a global stage. American sports fans are comfortable watching domestic leagues and calling them the pinnacle of their sport. The WNBA is the best women's basketball league in the world, and most American fans understand that intellectually. But there is something different about watching a player perform under international conditions, against international competition, wearing a national team jersey. It activates a different kind of investment, a different kind of pride. When Clark ran the offense for Team USA in Puerto Rico, wearing number 12, making passes that made even opposing coaches stop and watch, she wasn't just performing for the people who already believed in her. She was performing for the people who needed a different context to fully understand what they were looking at. International competition provided that context. And the people who found it through this tournament, the casual fans who tuned in out of curiosity and stayed because they couldn't look away, will not go back to being casual. That is how audiences permanently expand. Not through marketing campaigns. Not through league initiatives or broadcast deals or social media strategies, though all of those matter. Through moments. Through performances that are undeniable enough to convert witnesses into believers. Puerto Rico produced those moments. The ripple effects are already visible. Fever ticket demand for the upcoming season reached levels that required the franchise to expand their sales infrastructure to handle the volume. Clark's jersey, the WNBA number 22, not the international number 12, remained the best-selling jersey in the league by a margin that made the second-place number look almost irrelevant. Cunningham's own jersey sales spiked in the weeks following the tournament, a direct reflection of the attention her role in the Puerto Rico story had generated among fans who had known her name but not yet fully understood her value. Broadcast negotiations for WNBA games, already elevated by the 2024 ratings explosion, entered a new phase of conversation in which the numbers being discussed would have seemed fantasy-level ambitious just 3 years earlier. Networks that had previously treated women's basketball as a secondary consideration were now competing for positioning, because the audience data had made the business case impossible to dismiss. All of this traces back to a player who was told not yet in June 2024 and decided to turn that rejection into the most productive 2 years of her professional life. The sport is different now. Not because of one tournament. Not because of one player. But because the convergence of talent, timing, authenticity, and the refusal to be diminished by institutional resistance produced something that cannot be undone or reversed. The audience that found women's basketball through Caitlin Clark is not going anywhere. The players being inspired by what Clark and Cunningham and this generation of fever basketball represents are already in gymnasiums right now, working on logo threes and skip passes and the particular kind of fearless decision-making that Clark has made look like the natural way to play the game. They are watching. They are learning. They are coming. And the player who showed them what was possible is just getting started. There is a particular kind of hunger that only comes from being made to wait. Not the hunger of someone who has never tasted success. Not the ambition of a young player chasing their first real achievement. This is something older and sharper than that. This is the hunger of someone who has already proven everything to everyone who mattered, and is now operating with the memory of every moment they were underestimated burning quietly behind everything they do. Caitlin Clark carries that hunger into every room she enters now. And the 2026 FIBA World Cup is the room that matters most. Qualifying was never the destination. It was the permission slip. The piece of paper that said yes, you get to compete, yes, you earned your spot, yes, the process that excluded you 2 years ago has finally formally corrected itself. That matters. The validation of it matters more than Clark would probably admit publicly. But validation was never the goal. The goal was always the gold. The thing that Taurasi built her legacy on. The thing that number 12 has represented through 6 Olympic cycles and 3 World Cup campaigns. The thing that now falls to a new generation to continue. The World Cup field will be different from qualifying competition. Different in ways that will test Clark in dimensions that Puerto Rico simply couldn't. International basketball at full World Cup level brings together programs that spend 4 years specifically preparing for this tournament. Coaches who have studied every available piece of footage on every American player. Defensive systems designed from the ground up to neutralize specific strengths. Physical athletes who can match the WNBA's best in ways that regional qualifying competition often cannot. The margin for comfortable dominance shrinks considerably. The moments where Clark's pace and vision create easy advantages will be fewer. The moments where she has to manufacture something from nothing, against defenders who know exactly what she wants to do and have committed to taking it away, will be more frequent and more demanding. This is where legacies are actually written. Not in the games that are already won before they begin, but in the games where winning requires something beyond talent, where it requires will, Clark's will has never been the question. It has been the answer to every question anyone raised about her. The preparation for the World Cup will consume the space between now and the tournament in ways that most fans will never fully see. Film sessions that start before dawn. Conditioning work that pushes physical limits that were already being pushed during the WNBA season. The particular mental discipline of studying opponents not as general problems to solve but as specific individuals with specific tendencies that can be exploited at specific moments in specific game situations. Clark has always been a student of the game. At this level, being a student is not a virtue. It is a survival requirement. Her partnership with Cunningham will be tested differently at the World Cup than it was in Puerto Rico. The stakes will be higher, the opposition more sophisticated, and the moments of adversity more sustained. In qualifying, a bad quarter could be absorbed by the overall quality gap between teams. In World Cup competition, a bad quarter can cost you a game. A bad game can cost you a medal. There is no comfortable margin, no institutional quality gap to fall back on when the execution breaks down. This means the trust between Clark and Cunningham has to be deeper than what Puerto Rico required. Not because Puerto Rico was easy. It wasn't, particularly in those early days before the tension resolved and both players found their footing. But World Cup pressure is its own specific thing, the kind of pressure that reveals whether a partnership is built on genuine foundation or merely functional proximity. Everything suggests their foundation is genuine. Everything in how they have operated together since 2024 points toward a relationship that will not fracture under pressure but will instead find its best expression precisely because of it. Players who have already been tested don't fear tests. They recognize them. The broader Team USA picture for the World Cup carries its own fascinating complexity. This is a roster in transition. The generation that Taurasi anchored for so long, players who built their identities around defending American dominance in international competition, is giving way to a cohort whose international resumes are still being written. Clark is the most prominent member of that cohort but not the only one. There are players on this roster who arrived in Puerto Rico carrying questions similar to the ones Clark carried, whose answers are still forming, whose contributions to the national team story are still in early chapters. The dynamic of that transition, old guard and new generation finding a shared language, a shared competitive identity, is one of the most compelling subplots in women's basketball right now. And Clark, by virtue of her visibility and her performance, is at the center of it whether she positioned herself there deliberately or not. Leaders rarely choose their moment. The moment chooses them, and then the question is whether they are ready to inhabit it fully. Clark is ready. The evidence is overwhelming and it keeps accumulating. Not just in the scoring and the assists and the shooting percentages, though those numbers are extraordinary by any standard applied to any era of the game, but in the composure. In the refusal to make any moment smaller by shrinking within it. In the specific quality that separates the players who are great from the players who are historic. The ability to perform at their ceiling precisely when the ceiling matters most. Taurasi had it. The record proves it. 6 gold medals are not won by players who find their best selves only in comfortable circumstances. They are won by players who discover that pressure is not a threat to their performance but the condition under which their performance becomes most fully itself. Clark is that kind of player. Puerto Rico was the first real international evidence of it. The World Cup will be the second, larger and more definitive chapter. And somewhere in the preparation for that chapter, in a gym somewhere, in a film session that started before most people are awake, in the quiet accumulation of work that never makes highlights but makes champions, the unfinished business is being addressed. The Olympic roster that didn't include her name in 2024 cannot be retroactively corrected. That decision is permanent, and its permanent nature is part of what makes it useful. You cannot unfeel what you felt in the moment your name wasn't called. You cannot unknow what it cost you to respond with grace when everything in you wanted to respond with fury. That experience lives in the body and it shapes the player. It shaped Clark in ways that are visible to anyone who watched her before that summer and has watched her since. There is an edge to her game now that wasn't there in the same form at Iowa, or even in her early WNBA months. A sharpness in the eyes during film sessions. A particular intensity in the moments before tip-off when she is standing at half-court and the arena is still settling and the game hasn't started yet but she is already somewhere inside it, already playing it, already seeing what's coming before it arrives. That is what unfinished business looks like from the outside. From the inside, it probably feels something like purpose. The World Cup is ahead. The gold medal that Taurasi promised number 12 would earn is ahead. The continued construction of a legacy that is already historic and has years of chapters remaining is ahead. Caitlin Clark is not chasing anything anymore. She is being chased. And the distance between her and everything behind her grows a little larger every single day.